Lantos Human Rights Commission will come to order, and welcome to everyone. Today's hearing is an extremely important hearing and one which deserves greater recognition, not only from the Biden administration and our regional and European allies, but also and especially the Holy See, commonly called the Vatican, namely this hearing, the perilous state of religious freedom in Nicaragua. Nicaragua, under the dictator Daniel Ortega and his wife Rosario Murillo, has been on a downward trajectory since the 2018 crackdown over what began as protests over reduced Social Security benefits, but soon became a street referendum on the decline of democracy under the Ortega's rule. Our commission previously called attention to the deteriorating situation with regards to civil and political rights, more generally in Nicaragua, in a hearing in July of last year. Today, we are focusing on one other aspect, and of course, it's all taken as a whole. These are violations of fundamentally, universally recognized human rights. But this is the war of Ortega and Murillo that they're waging against religious freedom, and in particular, against the Catholic Church and an extraordinarily brave Catholic leader, Bishop Rolando Alvarez. As we've seen in so many countries, from Poland during the days of the Iron Curtain, solidarity and the strength of the church in combating atheistic communism, to China for decades, but especially under the brutal dictatorship of Xi Jinping and the CCP's most recent persecution and conviction of Cardinal Zen, and to countries in other places around the world, including the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The faith community, and the Catholic Church in particular, have often been the strongest institutional voice against tyranny and in the promotion of respect for human rights. So too in Nicaragua, where Ortega has taken an increasingly hard line against the Catholic Church, as clergy and other members of Nicaragua's Catholic community have criticized his government's democratic backsliding and human rights violations. Among other statements, Ortega reportedly has referred to priests as killers, terrorists, coup plotters, and accused the clergy of working on behalf of American imperialism. This is what psychologists refer to as projection. It is the Ortega regime that embraces violence and projects it on its opponents. The Catholic News Agency reports that over the last 4 years, the Catholic Church has been the target of some 190 attacks and desecrations. Such attacks have included fire bombings, blockades, increased patrols, arbitrary arrests, expulsions, and closures of religious media outlets. In 2019, for example, Monsignor Silvio Baez, a critic of the Ortega administration, revealed that he faced harassment, received death threats, and had been beaten. In March of 2022, Ortega withdrew the credentials of the papal nuncio in Managua, Archbishop Vladimir Stanislav Summertag, and expelled him from the country. In August of 2022, per Ortega's orders, the Nicaraguan National Police, or NNP, closed 7 Catholic radio stations due to their criticism of the Ortega administration. So much for free speech. It does not exist in Nicaragua. The NNP also placed Bishop Ronaldo Alvarez of the Diocese of Matagalpa, along with 5 priests, under house arrest, and then took him into custody, where he was kept incommunicado. Just a day before yesterday, we learned that Bishop Alvarez was finally brought before a Nicaraguan court and formally charged with the laughable crimes of, quote, conspiracy to undermine national integrity and spreading, quote, false news through informational technologies. I have the press release of the Managua Central Judicial Complex detailing these charges, which I, with the unanimous consent, would enter into the record. I also note that another priest who was forced into exile from Nicaragua, Uriel Antonio Vallejo, is named, and the court has called upon Interpol to seize him. This is another abuse, namely the corrupting of the Interpol red notice system by tyrannies such as Nicaragua, Russia, and the Chinese Communist Party. Many, myself included, have also questioned why the Holy See and Pope Francis, in particular, have not been more vocal in light of this persecution of the church and a courageous church leader like Bishop Alvarez, not to mention the expulsion of the Sisters of Charity, Mother Teresa's order of nuns from Nicaragua this past summer. They were reportedly forced to leave the country overland on foot to Costa Rica. We also know that the Ortega regime has repeatedly denied requests by political prisoners for Bibles, denying them even this small spiritual solace. I assume this relative silence was due to efforts behind the scenes to free Bishop Alvarez and others. And now that a formal judicial process has been initiated, the Pope and the Holy See will be less constrained in their comments, and they need to speak out strongly. Finally, I believe it is important. We need to highlight the names of some of those who have suffered religious persecution by the Ortega regime. I've already mentioned Father Valleos, and Oscar Danielo Benavides has also reportedly been arbitrarily arrested, along with Father Enrique Martinez Gamboa. There are other priests, seminarians, and lay Catholic journalists who have also been placed in detention. These individuals are included among the more than 236, I say again, 236 political prisoners that we believe through sources have been incarcerated by the Ortega regime, a list that also includes public servants and even judges. Well, today the Commission is grateful to welcome two powerful and amazing human rights leaders, Bianca Jagger, who has been just amazing in her advocacy for human rights worldwide, and in particular in Nicaragua. She is the founder and president of Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation, and Eddie Avesedo, who's the chief of staff and senior advisor to the President Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Jim McGovern, the co-chair of our commission, for any opening comments he might have.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And I join Co-Chair Smith in welcoming the witnesses and the audience to today's hearing on religious freedom in Nicaragua. This is the third time the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission has taken up the situation in Nicaragua since the ongoing political crisis exploded in April 2018 after the Ortega government violently repressed peaceful protests. In the first hearing that I led in September 2018, we had already received reports of attacks on the Catholic Church. In fact, there was a priest and a longtime friend who reached out to me about the emerging crisis. The Ortega government began going after the church because priests were safeguarding the rights of protesters and criticizing repression. Harassment and intimidation against the church and the clergy have continued since then. As of last June, the Catholic News Agency reported 190 attacks and desecrations against the church, including a fire caused by arson in the Cathedral of Managua. But things have escalated dramatically during 2022. In March, the government expelled the papal nuncio with no explanation. In May, Bishop Rolando Alvarez was forced to take refuge in a church and go on a hunger strike in response to police intimidation. In August, the police raided his Matagalpa diocese, detained him and several other priests, announced an investigation against the bishop for, quote, ongoing violent groups, quote, and placed him under house arrest. Only last Tuesday, 110 days later, was the bishop finally charged. His alleged crimes: conspiracy to undermine national integrity and propagation of false news. These are the same charges Nicaraguan prosecutors have used to condemn more than 40 political prisoners. In May, the television channel of Nicaragua's Episcopal Conference was taken off the air by the National Telecommunications Authority. In August, the same authorities closed 7 Catholic radio stations. In June, the government canceled the legal status of the Missionaries of Charity, Mother Teresa's order, and forced the nuns to leave the country. They have operated in Nicaragua since 1988. Several other Catholic charities were also ordered closed. The National Assembly revoked the legal status of one Catholic university and cut funding for another, the Jesuit-run Central American University, known for its decades of research and advocacy on the issue of social justice. In November, Ortega described the Catholic Church as a dictatorship. It is impossible not to conclude that all of this constitutes a systematic attack on the Church as an institution. That is why on December 2nd, the Biden administration designated Nicaragua as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. It is equally important to recognize that the persecution of the church is one aspect of the complete collapse of respect for human rights in Nicaragua. Since 2018, the human rights situation in the country has deteriorated at an exponential rate, as local advocates and international bodies can attest. With the closing of more than 2,000 non-governmental organizations, including the faith-based organizations that I mentioned earlier, the space for civil society has been decimated. More than 200,000 Nicaraguans have fled the country for political and economic reasons. Self-censure is widely practiced. One example, we reached out to several possible witnesses for the hearing today, but no one we talked to was willing to speak publicly for fear of reprisal. Without objection, I will again include in the record recent findings by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and UN bodies. We know what the church in Nicaragua has experienced directly, that the fundamental right to religious freedom does not exist in a vacuum. The church has come under attack because members of its clergy stood up for the rights of Nicaraguan citizens to freely express themselves, organize protests, and dissent. The people's exercise of those basic rights has become intolerable for the government led by Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo. The repression of those rights became intolerable for many in the church. In these circumstances, to stand in solidarity with the Nicaraguan church means that we must also stand in solidarity with all those Nicaraguans the church has sought to support and protect: social and political leaders, human rights defenders, journalists, student activists, and protesters. Many are now imprisoned or exiled. Others are still at risk within the country. In that spirit, I call today for the immediate release without conditions of three ordinary Nicaraguans: Luis Carlos Valle, Carla Escobar Yader, Polanco, who are recognized as prisoners of conscience in the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's Defending Freedoms Project. All three have joined in the 2018 protests and have paid for that with years in prison. Their cases are riddled with procedural flaws, and they have all been denied medical care while in prison. Luis and Carla have been granted protection measures by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. They are among the more than 200 political prisoners held in Nicaragua in miserable conditions in violations of Nicaragua's international human rights obligations. We must not allow any of them to be forgotten. What else should we do? I expect we will hear today that the administration should increase sanctions in Nicaragua. It's worth noting that as of November, Treasury had already imposed blocking sanctions on 44 individuals and 11 entities, including the country's top leadership, the National Police, the Attorney General, and state-owned enterprises. The State Department has restricted the visas of several hundred officials. So far, it is hard to argue that the sanctions alone have improved the situation on the ground. And I have to be honest, I believe we need some new thinking. We must move beyond the temptation to simply impose increasingly severe sanctions in the hope that somehow these will change the behavior of leaders who excel in avoiding the worst consequences for themselves while their people suffer. The way things look now, the status quo could go on forever. That's simply unacceptable. This is one of the reasons I welcome President Biden's November decision to name former Senator Chris Dodd as Special Presidential Advisor for the Americas. I hope his appointment signals that Central America and Latin America are moving up on the administration's diplomatic agenda. I believe we need a holistic, multilateral approach to dealing with the challenges we face in Nicaragua and throughout Central America. The democratic backsliding in El Salvador and Guatemala is just as concerning to me as the situation in Nicaragua. What we've been doing has not been working. If we don't want failed states and countless refugees, we need a better approach. Imagine what we might accomplish if sustained diplomatic energy similar to that devoted to Ukraine were also directed toward working hand in hand with pro-human rights governments to chart a different path in our own hemisphere. And with that, I thank the gentleman for the time, and I yield back.
I thank my good friend for his statement. And we are joined by Maria Elvira Salazar, who has been very outspoken, articulate, and matter of fact, one of the most knowledgeable people on Central America and other human rights issues over decades. She has joined us, and I yield to her such time as she may consume. Maria?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Yes, Smith, and delighted to be with Jim McGovern, whom I have known in Nicaragua. I met him there, and Mrs. Jagger and Eddie Acevedo, whom I know very well. I am as concerned as all of you, and I'm delighted to hear from Jim McGovern, Congressman McGovern, that we need to do more. And the question is, what can we do? Ortega, we have been talking about this topic for the last 35 years when we met in Nicaragua. And I was a news reporter, I'm a rookie, and you were a staffer. and we were all concerned and still we're concerned. And so what do you think the Biden administration could do? What type of signals do we need to send to Ortega, who has been in the political scene for Nicaragua for the last 40 years? Now that I believe that this administration did not send stronger signals in November to point out to this dictator that he could not steal the elections the way he did and put 7 presidential contenders in jail. One of them, our very good friend, Arturo Cruz. So I would love to hear from you, Jim, and from the other panelists. What else do you think we could do at this hour when Ortega has done the something that was unthinkable, hit on the Catholic Church? I yield back.
Thank you so very much for your statement and your leadership. I just before we go to our distinguished witnesses, I've worked on this issue since the early 1980s. Was elected in 81, but I'll never forget a meeting that Tony Hall, Frank Wolf, Bob McEwen, and I had with Ortega. He thought we were coming to praise him. It was in 1984, and we asked him hard questions about human rights and the pervasive use of torture. And when we left, his news media went ballistic over our visit. He thought we were coming, as I said, to praise this dictator, and we did just the opposite. We asked him hard questions. So you're right. There's been decades of repression by Daniel Ortega, but now he's gone to a new low point. And I do think we have to be even more aggressive in holding him to account. And we have not done all that we can do. CPC is a very good thing. I helped create it back in 1998 with Frank Wolf and wrote another law named after Frank Wolf on country of particular concern. But let's hope that the sanctions that are prescribed in the CPC designation are immediately and comprehensively applied to Nicaragua. So thank you for your comments. Now I'd like to go to our very distinguished witnesses and begin to say how pleased we are to welcome back Bianca Jagger. Bianca is a founder and president and chief executive of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation, which she established in 2005 to be a force for change and a voice for the most vulnerable. Ms. Jagger has committed her life to defending human rights, civil liberties, peace, social justice, and environmental protection throughout the world. She works to end violence against women and girls, to abolish capital punishment, and advocates for the rights of indigenous peoples and future generations. She is Council of Europe Goodwill Ambassador, a member of the Executive Director's Leadership Council for Amnesty International USA, the IUCN Bond Challenge Ambassador, and she has received numerous prestigious awards, including the Right Livelihood Award of 2004, also known as the alternative to the Nobel Prize. On a personal note, this is the third time that Bianca has testified at a hearing that I've chaired. In 1998, she gave extremely moving testimony before the House Committee on International Relations Subcommittee on Human Rights in a hearing that we called The Betrayal of Srebrenica. Why did the massacre happen, and will it happen again? She again appeared before our commission in another hearing that I chaired, and that was on political prisoners in July of last year. For those who have not heard her speak before, let me say that there are a few advocates who are as informed, articulate, and passionate as she is. There is no greater voice for the persecuted church in Nicaragua than Bianca Jagger, and her consistent advocacy on behalf of religious prisoners of conscience, and in particular Bishop Ronaldo Alvarez, who just this week was finally accorded at least a judicial process, which I think will be a sham as well, she has helped to keep the issue in the forefront. Indeed, just this week, we saw two major news articles come out of the Ortega regime's assault on the church. One was by Mary O'Grady in the Wall Street Journal, and the other by Susan Crabtree in Real Clear Politics. And without objection, we will make both of those very, very incisive articles as part of the record. So again, I thank you, Bianca. Secondly, we'll hear from Eddie Avecedo, who is no stranger to Capitol Hill. I've known him for decades as well. And because of his tireless work over the years, is someone well known to both me, our office, and to offices both in the House and the Senate. Eddie spent over 15 years in government service at the intersection of domestic and foreign policy, and advocates on behalf of U.S. national security objectives, democratic values, and international cooperation. From 2011, when I first met him, to 2017, Eddie served as the senior professional staff member overseeing the Western Hemisphere portfolio for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and later became the senior foreign policy advisor and subcommittee staff director for the subcommittee on the Middle East and Africa for Chairwoman Ileana Ross-Layton, where they enacted several bills into law, including matters relating to Israel, Jordan, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. After a tenure first at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, in several senior management positions, and after serving as Senior Director of Communications and Policy at the McCain Institute for International Leadership, Eddie now serves as the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green, another close friend who used to serve on my subcommittee, who once served and also, of course, did his great work at USAID. Eddie holds a master's degree from the School of Foreign Service from Georgetown University and dual bachelor's of science in psychology and political science from Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. He is emerging, I believe, as one of the leading voices on the current situation in Nicaragua, and we are happy to welcome him back as well. Ms. Jagger, the floor is yours.
Well, it is a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. Can you hear me? Yes, you can. I would like to begin by thanking the honorable co-chairs of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Congressman Chris Smith, who is always a pleasure to see you back, who I have known for quite a few years and have always admired your commitment to human rights and the rule of law throughout the world. Congressman Jim McGovern, thank you for inviting me to testify before you. The human rights situation in Nicaragua, the country of my birth, has dramatically deteriorated since I spoke to you on the 21st of July, 2021. For the purpose of today's proceedings, I will focus my testimony on the crackdown of religious freedom in Nicaragua. It is actually quite difficult to be testifying before a committee where you are so well informed, which means that anything almost that I could say to you, you already have said it and you know it. You know so well what's happening in the country. Yesterday, or more exactly, the day before, when I was writing my testimony, I received the alarming news that the dictatorial regime of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo had initiated in the Criminal District Court in Managua an infamous process against Bishop Rolando Jose Alvarez Lagos, Bishop of the Diocese of Matagalpa and Apostolic Administrator of the Diocese of Estelí. They charged him, as you well said, with an absurd accusation of conspiracy to undermine the national integrity and propagation of false news through information technologies. He was exhibited sitting on the defendant's chair, looking physically deteriorated, having lost weight, looking pale, and stripped of his soutane. For 131 days, he was held captive, isolated, and incommunicado in an undisclosed location with no formal accusation, access to legal defense, and with a serious deteriorating health for predicating peace and spreading the gospel. Bishop Alvarez Lagos is the latest Catholic prelate to be charged with trumped-up charges as part of the Ortega Murillo brutal crackdown on the church. It has been speculated that a member of the Nicaraguan Catholic hierarchy has tried to persuade the bishop that the best option for him and for members of the Catholic Church was to leave Nicaragua. But Monsignor Alvarez Lago has always stated that he was not willing to leave the country. Monsignor Alvarez Lago is a man of God, at the mercy of a murderous regime, a man of courage, principles, and tremendous integrity, who is prepared to risk his life to defend the alienable rights, not just of the Catholic faithful, but of all oppressed people in Nicaragua. I never forget when I heard him thank the people who were supporting him, when he thanked not only the Catholics in Nicaragua, but anyone, including the agnostics, people from other religion. And that has been always the word of Monsignor Alvarez Lago, targeting Bishop Rolando Alvarez at a time when millions of Christians around the world prepare to celebrate one of the most important dates of the year, Christmas. Is when families and friends come together for renewed strength, for healing, for forgiveness and reconciliation, a time for peace, a time for joy. But instead in Nicaragua, the Ortega Murillo regime is escalating their unholy war against the Catholic Church. Following the nonviolent and widespread anti-government protests in April 2018, the dictatorial regime of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo launched an attack on all dissenting voices. And since then, his regime has increased its brutal repression. Since then, the Catholic Church in general has been instrumental in providing avenues for dialogue and understanding, whilst maintaining a very clear message in support of democracy, freedom, and human rights. Some of the most vocal critics of the regime have come precisely from the ranks of the Catholic clergy. Monsignor Silvio Baez, which you mentioned before, Assistant Bishop of Managua, was forced into exile because of serious physical attacks against him were perpetrated. Similarly, many highly charismatic priests were forced to seek refuge abroad after intense persecution by the regime. One very notorious case was that of Father Edwin Roman, who was held hostage for a week inside his parish in the iconic Monimbo community in Masaya, surrounded by police forces and paramilitary squad with no electricity, no running water, or access to food and medicine. I want to say to you that I have known many of the people that I am speaking about, that for me, advocating and speaking and standing up for them is not just simply another exercise of a human rights defender. I am deeply concerned, deeply moved, and deeply saddened for what is happening to priests, to the bishop, and to all those who are part of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. Since the protests in 2018, nearly 400 Nicaraguans have been killed due to state violence. As certified by reputable international human rights organization, which concluded that crimes against humanity have been perpetrated by the Ortega Murillo dictatorial regime. I would like to say that I'm here to speak on behalf of Bishop Alvarez Lago, the priests that are in jail, the seminarians, and the lay persons. But I am here also to remind you, even though you had a hearing where I spoke to about all the political prisoners that are in Nicaragua today, political prisoners whose lives are at stake, who are being victims of torture, many of them with very serious health issues that we shouldn't forget. And I'm sure that Bishop Alvarez and the priests that are in jail will be the first who will be supporting that. Two fundamental pillars of Nicaraguan democracy, the Catholic Church and the independent media, have been practically trampled by the Ortega Murillo regime. Ortega accused them of being accomplices of an alleged coup d'etat in 2018, a spurious claim which has never been proven. To silence and frighten the Nicaraguan people, Ortega and Murillo launched an unprecedented crackdown on the freedom of the press by closing and confiscating some of the most important independent media in Nicaragua, such as El Diario, La Prensa, Confidencial, Canal 100% Noticias, and Radio Darío, and many, many others. And this is not, unfortunately, the hearing for that. Ortega and Murillo war against civil society has led him to arbitrarily cancel the legal status of more than 3,000 NGOs in a sweeping purge of civil society, human rights, and humanitarian organizations, including several religious organizations that provide support for the most impoverished sections of the population. That is what is so outrageous, is that the people that are suffering from what Daniel Ortega is doing are the poorest. It is not really, as many think, that when we ask for sanctions, we will be causing more suffering to the people of Nicaragua. I will give you a short chronology, and I know that you are all so well versed about what happened in Nicaragua, of the Ortega Murillo crackdown on the Catholic Church this year alone. In March, Monsignor Valdemar Stanislaw Sommertag, the apostolic nuncio, was ousted from Nicaragua by the regime, an action that the Holy See described as incomprehensible because Sommertag has worked tirelessly for the good of the church and the Nicaraguan people. On 1st of August, Bishop Rolando Alvarez Lago released a statement saying that the Nicaraguan communication regulator, Telcor, had ordered them to close their radio station after falsely accusing them of operating without a valid license. I never forget when Bishop Alvarez spoke, and it was one of the few times when you saw him absolutely outraged and angry about what they did to him. By the end of August, the government had ordered the closure of 10 Catholic radio stations and 3 television stations. On the 4th of August, Bishop Alvarez Lago was held hostage in the clergy house of the Diocese of Matagalpa and was prevented from officiating Mass in the cathedral. Security forces also prohibited members of the group, 5 priests, 2 seminarians, 2 lay persons, and 1 photographer from leaving the house. I must tell you, because I haven't spoken to, that I was in touch with some of the people that were inside the curial house when Bishop was held hostage. And we were counting the days because they were not allowed. The police was encircling and blockading the house for 15 days and not allowed anyone to go in and bring them food and bring them water or necessary medicine. And I was counting the days thinking, when will they run out of food? Are they going to try to starve them inside? But in the early hours of the 19th of August, and I will tell you that on that night, I had spoken to someone about how they were. And because as well, I wanted to, I was continuously concerned about this issue of the food. And so at 3 in the morning in Nicaragua, the special forces of the regime violently broke the door and forced their way in to kidnap Monsignor Alvarez Lagos and his companions. They were taken in separate vehicles to the others of his companions were taken to the notorious prison of El Chipote and since then have been formally accused of conspiracy to undermine national integrity and spreading of fake news in detriment of the state of Nicaragua, all in accordance with the Russian-inspired amendment made on the penal code by the regime to late 2020. On the 13th of December, 2 days ago, as I mentioned above, they brought Bishop Alvarez to court to face charges. And last Sunday, on the 11th of December, two journalists, Manuel Obando Cortedano and Wilberto Artola from the media diocese of Matagalpa, were kidnapped by the police, and their whereabouts are unknown as far as I know. It could be that they are already in El Chipote. Holding a bishop captive, the imprisonment of priests and seminarians, the relentless persecution that is forcing many of them to flee the country to save their lives, preventing them to return to their own country, and also expelling dozens of foreign priests and nuns, such as the case of the missionary of charity of the Order of Mother Teresa, are some of the cruel and unspeakable method used by the Ortega Murillo regime to crack down on the Catholic Church. And you know, when I was writing this speech, I keep saying, is it just simply to crack down on the Catholic Church, or is it to destroy the Catholic Church in Nicaragua? If we really look closely to this, and I think that unfortunately, that the Holy Seed and as well Cardinal Brenners have believed all throughout this that there was a possibility of a dialogue with this murderous regime. And I have asked and I have pleaded with His Sanctity Pope Francis to please condemn the regime of Daniel Ortega, to please intercede on behalf of Monsignor Alvarez and the priests that are in jail and the seminarian and the Catholic Church in Nicaragua as an institution. And I've been hearing the argument that there is a need for a dialogue with the country. Well, Congressman and Congresswoman, I think that you know that as a human rights defender throughout my life, I have always believed that one should follow a path of dialogue. But I always believe that one follow that path when there are some possibilities, not when you're dealing with a regime that is committing crimes against humanity and that every day is increasing the persecution of the church, of the people of Nicaragua, that is increasingly torturing the political prisoners. How can that be? And will we now hear from His Sanctity Pope Francis and from the Conference of Bishops in Nicaragua and from Cardinal Brenners? I hope we will. Amidst the terrible state of persecution, the regime has increased the shutdown on any public activities or event of religious nature, especially in those cities, neighborhoods, or communities where the regime has no absolute control through their police forces or paramilitary squad. That is precisely the case of Masaya. Some of you who know Nicaragua, Masaya was the birth. It was the city that was so important for the Sandinista revolution, but that today is stand valiantly denouncing what Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo are doing. And let's not forget the North Caribbean autonomous regime and Jinotega, Nueva Segovia, and the persecution of other religions in Nicaragua, because it's not only of Catholics, but of every kind of religion is suffering the oppression of this regime. As you know, Nicaragua is traditionally and culturally a very devout country. The role that religion plays in everyday life is important. Regardless of ideology, class, or race, faith remains a unifying factor. And what is really important to point out, is to show that the persecution of the church has made the Catholic Church more popular among the people. And you know why am I here speaking to you about Monsignor Alvarez and the other priests? Is that I admire him. He is a prophetic voice. He is a man of God that speaks to all the people of Nicaragua from all social classes. It doesn't matter whether they're rich or poor, whether they're Catholic or whether they are not. This is a man that has a tremendous power and has a tremendous influence. And that's the reason why Daniel Ortega is using everything against him and why I fear for his life. I don't want to see another bishop killed in Central America. I worked in El Salvador and remember very well what happened there. It is important, Congressman and Congresswoman, that we have you help and that you use all the avenues and everything that is available to you. You already have a bipartisan legislation, Renaissance, that gives you all the available mechanism to be able to impose serious sanctions against the regime of Daniel Ortega. And perhaps to some of you, it will surprise you that a human rights defender who for many years have questioned the issue of imposing financial and economic sanctions on country, I come to the conclusion that in Nicaragua, you have a big prison where the people are suffering, that you have a terrorist state that is persecuting anyone who dares question what they are doing. And it is for that reason, because I fear for the life of the political prisoners, because I fear for the life of Monsignor Alvarez, for the life of the priests and seminarians and anyone who stand and raises their voice, that I come before you to plead you to please. I know that there's so many other important things. I know there is Ukraine and that I live in London and I am Nicaraguan and British. I understand the importance. I know Nicaragua is a very small country. I know we don't have petrol, but we are a very important country from the geopolitical point of view. We are a country that currently have Russian soldiers in our soil. It is a country that will have military exercise with the Russian, that have made a so-called nuclear agreement for, efficient energy. But it is an important geopolitical country that should not be forgotten. We don't want to see a repetition of the missile crisis that you had in Cuba. And so I want to thank you for inviting me. And I really commend you for your interest and for your knowledge of what happened in Nicaragua. And both of you, congressmen, that I have come to testify before you on other occasions, I am really grateful for this opportunity, and I do hope that you will not forget us, and that you will certainly not forget Monsignor Alvarez, the priest, the seminarians, the lay person, and all the political prisoners who are at stake today in Nicaragua. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Bianca, thank you so very much for that extraordinarily powerful, insightful, and persuasive testimony. Every member of Congress, both sides of the aisle, Senate and House, needs to hear your voice. And I thank you for that. You are a tremendous leader and bearing witness in your appeal to the Pope. I mean, it should be a given, like John Paul II, with solidarity, standing hand in hand with those who are fighting for freedom and against repression. I join you in appealing to Pope Francis and the Secretary of State Perilous to make sure that his voice is heard in a very, very serious way. It has not been. So hopefully your appeal today will help move that in that direction, because the sooner the better. We can't just sit while an existential threat has become a reality against the Catholics, and as you put it, against all the other faiths as well. This is militant atheism at its worst, to quote Solzhenitsyn, going after the people of faith and hating God as well. And that's exactly what Ortega is doing. I'd like to now yield to Eddie for his testimony. And again, thank you, Bianca.
Thank you so much, Co-Chair Smith, Co-Chair McGovern, and members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Thank you for holding this important hearing on the atrocities occurring in Nicaragua under the ruthless regime of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo. As a former staffer that worked on the House Foreign Affairs Committee with Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, it is an honor for me to be here today. I personally witnessed Ms. Ros-Lehtinen work hand in hand with many of you, including the Honorable Tom Lantos himself, on many important human rights matters, and demonstrated how we could be the voice for those oppressed abroad. The International Religious Freedom Act institutionalized the significance of protecting and advancing religious freedom around the world as part of our foreign policy. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights reaffirms that religious freedom is a universal human right for all. This declaration has been signed and ratified by more than 170 countries, including Nicaragua. However, Daniel Ortega sees religious freedom and communities of faith as a threat to his authoritarian rule. This year alone, as many of you have already mentioned, Ortega has closed several Catholic radio stations, expelled the nuns from Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity, expelled the Religious Sisters of the Cross, expelled the Vatican's Papal Nuncio, detained Father Enrique Martinez Gamboa, and put Matagalpa's Bishop Rolando Alvarez under house arrest. Just this week, the public ministry filed charges against Bishop Alvarez for crimes of conspiracy to undermine national integrity to the detriment of the Nicaraguan state and society. This is despicable. In the last few days, a news reporter of the Diocese of Matagalpa, Manuel Owando, was captured and detained, and Father Uriel Antonio Vallejos was placed on Interpol's Red Notice list. According to recent press reports, at least 11 priests have been arbitrarily arrested. Due to these atrocities, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken designated Nicaragua as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. But the abuses do not stop at attacks on religious freedom and the church. The Ortega Murillo regime is currently holding more than 235 political prisoners, and this number continues to grow. These prisoners being held unjustly face torture, weight loss, human rights abuses, and lack of access to basic necessities, including adequate medical attention. Additionally, they have been denied due process rights and have faced sham trials. They have been held incommunicado for over 80 days multiple times without any phone calls or communication with family members and loved ones, and no access to reading and writing materials, not even Bibles. Put simply, all Nicaraguans are living under an illegitimate, repressive regime that is constantly violating their human rights and denying them basic freedoms. I say illegitimate because Ortega dismissed the Nicaraguan Constitution, which previously barred him from currently being in control in the first place. In November 2011, over 10 years ago, former House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen convened a congressional hearing entitled Democracy Held Hostage in Nicaragua. At that hearing, Robert Callahan, the former U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua, testified that, quote, Daniel Ortega's candidacy was illegal, illegitimate, and unconstitutional, end quote. Ortega rules Nicaragua with an iron fist, and the oppression has been happening for far too long. In April 2018, Nicaraguans went into the streets to protest Ortega's dictatorship and were met with brute force. According to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the number of people massacred is at least 355, with many more injured, including the clergy. During my time at the U.S. Agency for International Development, religious freedom and the aggression of the regime in Nicaragua was a top priority for former Administrator Mark Green and the agency as a whole. USAID allocated new funds to raise international awareness of the Nicaraguan regime's repression of religious leaders and to document human rights violations. In addition to supporting these sort of programs, the U.S. has other tools available to bring about change, and I would like to offer the following recommendations. First, Ortega is not allowing the new Senate-confirmed U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua to enter the country. Therefore, the U.S. should expel the Nicaraguan ambassador to the U.S. immediately. Second, Congress, in a bipartisan manner, has worked hard to hold the Ortega regime accountable through two bills that have been passed and signed into law, the NICA Act and the Renacer Act. However, these bills are not, I repeat, are not being fully enforced. Congressional intent was clear that the U.S. must use its voice, vote, and influence to block loans to Nicaragua unless the loans promote democracy at each international financial institution. Yet, according to Congressman Albiocides, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank have loaned at least $1.2 billion to the Ortega regime since 2018. This is unacceptable. Third, the United States must consider expelling Nicaragua from the Central America Free Trade Agreement, DR-CAFTA. While this may be a difficult task, the administration has come up with a unique way to implement similar restrictions. On October 2022, President Joe Biden made changes to Executive Order 13851 by authorizing the United States to be able to prohibit imports from Nicaragua to the U.S., exports from the U.S. to Nicaragua, and to prohibit new investments into the Nicaraguan economy. This is a positive step forward, but these authorities should be executed and utilized immediately against sectors that Ortega, his family, or his private sector collaborators control. Nicaraguans today live under an illegitimate tyrannical regime that uses violence, fear, intimidation, unjust incarceration, and state-sponsored killings to maintain its iron grip on the country. We should continue to work in a bipartisan manner with an international coalition to help Nicaraguans. The people are crying out for freedom and continue to put their lives at risk to demand democratic order, justice, and liberty. On a personal note, I would like to say I myself am a Catholic. My educational background is with the Jesuits. I went to middle school and high school in Miami at Belen Jesuit, did my undergrad at Spring Hill College, did my graduate degree at Georgetown, all Jesuit institutions. However, my foundation comes from the Miami Jesuits, who were kicked out of Cuba by Fidel Castro. So they see the world through this important lens. I say that because I recognize that the Pope is a Jesuit, and I believe that we need the Pope and the Vatican to speak up and speak often regarding the atrocities occurring in Nicaragua. Many historians credit John Paul II for helping bring down communism. And he once said, quote, "Freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought," end quote. This is a sort of moral and brave, courageous leadership we need today, not just in Nicaragua, but in many countries throughout the world where the church is under siege by authoritarians. Lastly, I just want to convey a message to the people of Nicaragua. Do not lose hope. Do not lose faith. You are not alone, and we hear your cries. You will prevail in one day bringing democracy and freedom back to your country. Thank you.
Eddie, thank you so very much. And your message to the Nicaraguan people is so well stated. They are not forgotten in a bipartisan way, bicameral, House and Senate, and the American people, most importantly, care for their plight. Many still are unaware just how egregious it is, the things that Ortega is doing. And my hope is that the news media, and we've tried even with this hearing, to get them to cover it, to listen to our two great witnesses, you and Bianca Jagger, because you're sounding the alarm bell in a way that and that goes to the Vatican, that goes to the White House, it goes to the Congress. I mean, I'm glad that President Biden designated Nicaragua as a CPC country. We've called for it before, but now the key is, because it's a two-part law, because I worked with Frank Wolf when he wrote it in 1998, its designation and its implementation of the up to 18 sanctions that could be meted out on a country where religious freedom is being violated with impunity, earning them country of particular concern. So my hope is that step two will be done quickly. Don't wait. Part of over the years has been designation followed by inaction. So hopefully there won't be inaction on that. And your points about the loans, I mean, it is unconscionable that we have not done everything to stop loans from going to prop up this dirty dictatorship that is abusing its own people so horribly. And Dr. Kafta, I certainly agree with you on that. Trading with someone who is doing this, who gleans money and power from the trade, makes us enablers and complicit in these crimes. Even if it's unwitting, it's still, we're a part of it now. So I think your points have been extremely well taken. And but I just, I do hope, and we will get this hearing record to the Vatican, to the Secretary of State, and to the Nuncio here in Washington, and ask them to watch it, to hear all of our appeals, but especially you and Bianca's appeal to the Pope. John Paul II inspired all of us. He is my favorite Pope. Met him a couple of times, but it was obviously very quick. But followed and read his messages faithfully. And what he did, as you pointed out, Eddie, to help bring down communism, because he understood it. And having escaped through the terrible years of Nazism in Poland, he understood dictatorships. My hope is that this Pope will realize that, Pope Francis, that quiet diplomacy, if that's what's happening, we don't know. Words that are seen as weak does nothing but enable dictatorships, whether it be Xi Jinping or Daniel Ortega. And again, Bianca, thank you for reminding us about the Russians and their foothold in Nicaragua. There's just problems everywhere, but we can't escape notice when so many people are being slaughtered, tortured, and a church is being literally destroyed right before our eyes. So we will do much more continuing. It'll be bipartisan, which I think it has to be. We're all on the same page and saying, not now, not ever. And, if we could ever get into Nicaragua, and I've talked to Bianca about this, I'd love to go to the prisons. I've been in prisons all over the world. In Indonesia, when right before Jakarta fell, it had Timor-Leste, East Timor, met with the leader who was there, Guzman, went to Perm Camp 35. Just yesterday, a woman was here who we helped get her husband out of Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains back in the 1980s. So, I think your message about hope is so important. But again, we've got to realize if we could get into the prisons, Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General, has said things. More needs to be said. I do think, we need to be looking at tribunal, to hold this kind of atrocity to account. We know that Charles Taylor never thought for a moment that he would be sitting at The Hague for 50 years for crimes against humanity. But we know that hybrid court in Sierra Leone did an amazing job in holding people who committed atrocities to account, and they're now serving, especially the former president of Liberia, 50 years. And Ortega needs to know that. The ICC could look into this. There are other, these crimes are so massive, and what they do, the ones we know about, are just the tip of the iceberg. And what they do to other people that we never know about that disappear remains a serious problem. So, I yield to my colleagues if they wanted to make any comments further or questions. And if you have anything further you would like to say, before we close. Jim.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I want to thank both of our witnesses. And I just want to kind of add to something I said in the beginning. I have been frustrated with administration after administration, Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, because I don't think we have adequately focused on Latin America. We approach it in piecemeal ways, and quite frankly, when I look at our policy toward Nicaragua right now, I think it lacks imagination. It's not clear on getting to a solution to resolving the conflict. It's kind of predictable. It's kind of what we do with the governments in Latin America that we disagree with. We impose sanctions, and sanctions are a tool, but they're not in and of themselves getting you to a solution. And I'm not here to argue about the sanctions against Nicaragua. What I worry about is a situation where we just impose sanctions and that's it, and nothing changes. People suffer. I mean, we will have a disagreement on our policy toward Cuba, but I think our policy toward Cuba really hasn't changed the government. It hasn't done anything other than the people in Cuba are suffering, and in fact, people are showing up to our border, and that policy lacks imagination. And I really do think that we need to, be working with governments, not just to figure out how we get progress in Nicaragua and how we get prisoners released and how we end the persecution against the church, but there are other countries in Latin America that are doing horrific things that, we are less focused on. I am worried about what's happening in El Salvador. You want to talk about backsliding in democracy? Look at El Salvador, and yet, we're not as focused on that, or what's happening in Guatemala. And so there has to be a better way to figure out a multilateral approach that actually gets us to a solution. Because as I hear all this, there are lots, and Mr. Acevedo, I'm not opposed to saying to the Nicaraguan government, you know what, your ambassador is not welcome here until our ambassador is welcome there. Because I do think ultimately we need ambassadors because we want to keep lines of communication open, because there may be things that we can negotiate and get and help people. But I think that ought to be something, I'm a big believer in reciprocity. You want to treat us this way, you get the same treatment in return. Those kinds of things I think can be useful. But I keep on asking myself, how do you get to the ending we want here? And what is the ending that we are expecting? Because bad governments, even under harsh sanctions, can go on for a long, long, long time. We see that with Ortega and Murillo, right? And, when I see photographs of them, they're not going without nice meals. They're not going without nice housing. They're not going with, they're getting all the benefits that they've always gotten. And yet the people are suffering. They're suffering from the attacks on religious freedom. They're suffering from the poverty. They're suffering from food shortages. So we have to, I think that there needs to be a greater focus on the region and on how do you build a process that will get us So even if these governments just don't leave now, that they start to open up a little bit. And the final thing I'm going to say is, look, um, I'm a Catholic. I didn't get a Jesuit education, except when I was a staffer a long time ago. I spent a lot of time in El Salvador and at the University of Central America, got an education from those Jesuits, and in fact was the chief investigator for Congressman Joe Moakley of Boston into the murders of the 6 Jesuit priests at the University of Central America. And if you remember, those priests were murdered by Salvadoran armed members of the Salvadoran Armed Forces, who actually we trained in the United States and we supported militarily. And they taught me a lot about justice as well. But like I said, I mean, I am with you in the outrage, and I am horrified. I think we have to say we have to think a little bit outside our comfort zone as to how we get people released and how we open up political space. And so anyway, that's my reaction. And I really, Ms. Jagger, I appreciate all of your work on human rights in so many countries. And your voice is powerful, and people pay attention when you speak. And Mr. Acevedo, we've been together before. I appreciate your contributions. We may be coming at some of this from some different, perspectives here, but I think we're all trying to figure out how do you get to a point where, we can say things are working. And in any event, with that, I thank you both, and I yield back to my co-chair.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And if you wanted to respond again, Jim, please do. But I do think sanctions are a tool, and a very important tool. Magnitsky Act sanctions certainly make a difference. You and I worked so hard on that. I actually am the author of the Belarus Democracy Act, and we got many political prisoners out from Lukashenko's horrible prisons in Belarus because of it. They're not a panacea. They're not, a brass ring that works every time. But when we're actually enabling them with loans, I think you said it was 1.2 billion, Eddie. That's complicity, and short of war, and no one wants war ever, starving a regime of the wherewithal to carry it on. And I do think tribunals need to be used far more than they have been used.
Yeah.
I have a resolution pending on Putin, and I can't get it passed.
Right,
but it says don't wait until we're counting how many graves of Ukrainians and others have been killed. Let's level charges against Putin and his cronies right now, and try to get him. And that could be done through the UN General Assembly. It could be done.
Yeah, but I just say I'm not. If they're getting loans to do things that are not emergency related, I think some of these loans were related to hurricane damage and COVID response. I'm not sure. I wouldn't personally be opposed to that. I mean, I want people to have access to.
Jim, as you know, every sanction we've ever done, and I've written several of them, there's always a caveat for emergency response, humanitarian assistance.
Right.
Even the International Religious Freedom Act has a very strong.
I think some of these loans that Albio Ceres was referring to were loans for COVID and hurricane relief. But anyway, I hear you. But thank you.
If I could just respond real quick. Mr. McGovern, I agree with you completely. I mean, this comes down to, at the end of the day, like you said, we may have some disagreements, but I think we would agree that we need more attention in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere plays such an important role for our country, for our interests, and that is what is needed. On the sanctions front on Nicaragua, what happens typically in the last few years is we do a sanction, we make ourselves feel better, we pat ourselves on the back, and then we don't do anything on Nicaragua for 6-7 months. Then we do another sanction, and the clock starts over again. So that is not working, obviously, and we need more attention to the hemisphere. I will say this: you are correct, Mr. McGovern, in terms of some of the loans being COVID related. I would say there's an irony there because the Ortega regime denied the COVID even existed and did not do anything to help the people in response to COVID, and frankly, actually did the opposite in terms of aiding and abetting sort of the disease in the country. So to give him COVID money is a bit ironic. From a U.S. interest standpoint, as you have said, a lot of these people are now speaking with their feet. We see an increase of Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Cubans at the U.S. border that has to deal with our interests. There's a reason why these people are fleeing these dictatorships and they're coming to our border. So this is something that we need to pay attention to. One last thing that that Ms. Jagger had mentioned that I want to underscore. The Russia piece in Managua is something that needs to be paid more attention to, vis-a-vis what's happening in Ukraine. Let me be a little bit more specific. Ortega has allowed Russian military activity in Managua, just a few miles from the US. He has hosted military hardware from Russia, including T-72 tanks, and even hosted Russia's Tu-160 Blackjack bombers. In June 2022, just a few months ago, Ortega went a step further and had his controlled National Congress pass legislation that authorizes the presence of Russian troops, warships, and military equipment in the country. Russia also has installed a global positioning satellite system in Nicaragua, which many believe is a front to allegedly conduct surveillance and spy on the United States. My point in saying this is whatever activities may be happening in Ukraine vis-a-vis that unprovoked war by Putin, he may respond by what he is setting up in Managua. And if you all remember, back in the day, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the Russians had a spy facility in Lourdes, Cuba. And many members of Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, worked with the State Department and Secretary Rice at the time to kick out the Russians from Cuba. And we were successful in that endeavor. Now we are looking at Russians are beefing up their activities, not only in Nicaragua, but also in Venezuela. And that is something that I think does not get enough attention. Thank you.
We cannot hear you.
I would like to, if I may, add something else. Congressman McGovern, with regards to what it was claimed that some of these loans were to do with the COVID virus, I can tell you that there's been a shocking persecution of doctors in Nicaragua and nurses who have had to flee the country. I know a few that are in the United States that they have been able to obtain asylum because if they were speaking or they were saying that somebody died of the COVID virus, they will be persecuted or fired from saying. The other thing that I would like to tell you is that some of those loans that supposedly are for environmental issues or to help indigenous peoples, that there's been a brutal repression of indigenous people in Nicaragua. And one of the things that I like to mention is, I don't know if you know that Nicaragua is the third largest seller of meat to the United States. Now, many of that, or much of that meat, is coming from regions where indigenous people have their land occupied and who have been murdered to occupy the land, and that it will be really important that there be an investigation from members of Congress to see in which way could we achieve that there is a ban for Nicaragua to be able to sell tainted with blood meat from that country to the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would either of you like to say anything before we conclude? You've said so much and so well. If not, I thank you so very, very much. Jim, good seeing you again, as always. And I thank you for your testimony. And we will widely circulate your very, very powerful comments to as far and wide as we can, including to the Vatican. So thank you. The hearing is adjourned.